John Quincy Adams is recorded saying, quote, "Weights and measures may be ranked among the necessities of life to every individual of human society. The importance of measurements lies in the amount of times they're used daily, thus making the apparatus for measuring the system of measurement equally important." In the late 1970s, after centuries of perpetual discord, conflict between the United States government and American labor broke out regarding the newly passed Metric Conversion Act, which called for the replacement of the U.S. customary system with that of the metric system. A failure to compromise on behalf of both opposing parties has paradoxically had both little and great effect on American life overall.
You find it easier to use a meter and kilogram. Be a smart citizen and use the number 10.
The U.S. customary system began in England as a conglomeration of many other systems of weights and measures, allowing it to develop without set standards. Without a definite standard, fraudulency became a commonality in trade. Eventually, English monarchs established definite measures which lessened fraud. Other European countries, namely France, shared these issues. Consequently, the Paris Academy of Science developed the International System of Units in the late 17th century, which they believed could become universal and encourage international trade. The International System of Units became known as the metric system. In the first annual address to Congress, President George Washington addressed the need for an established system of measurements in the newly formed United States of America. Thomas Jefferson, tasked with this endeavor, suggested the metric system. However, Congress continually disregarded this and future council as it was not seen as a priority. On April 7, 1795, the metric system, though heavily resisted, was legalized in France following thorough refinement. Soon after, the French Revolution began, which saw the metric system abandoned until spontaneous adoption in the 1830s. As France became increasingly metric, surrounding European nations also commenced conversion. Due to this extensive conversion, the U.S. authorized use of metric units in 1866, but because this legislation was neither promotional nor mandatory, it was largely disregarded. 9 years later, the U.S. took part in the Diplomatic Conference on the Meter and became a signatory to the Treaty of the Meter, establishing America as officially metric. However, due to the public's refusal to use the metric system, conversion was abandoned. In 1876, the first metric advocacy group, the American Metric Bureau, was established. In response, the International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Weights and Measures was established 3 years later as the first organized metric opposition. By the 1890s, dissension had swelled. The most notable enmity came from Frederick Halsey and Samuel Dale, who presented works detailing the failings of the metric system and feasible repercussions of conversion to Congress. Together they founded the American Institute of Weights and Measures with the backing of several industries. In the early 20th century, several federally funded groups were created, including the National Bureau of Standards. In 1929, the Great Depression effectively silenced the metric debate, and as the economy grew through World War II, metrication did not seem necessary to most. In 1968, the U.S. metric study began due to the metrication of the pharmaceutical industry, which aimed to address the concerns of industry workers and advise the government on the best course of action. The study concluded in 1971, stating that some industries were willing to convert while others remained opposed. The study also found that metrication would aid the economy as it would allow more vigorous foreign trade. In line with this, the study suggested converting within the subsequent years. By this time, many other countries had converted or were in the process of converting, prompted by various factors. However, the American people maintained that conversion would be futile as the economy was flourishing, most international trade was bulk measured items, and most trade was with the British Commonwealth, which had not yet converted to the metric system. Then, in the early 1970s, the British Commonwealth divulged intent to convert to the metric system. This announcement did little to change the minds of Americans, though. Regardless, it did resonate with legislators. In 1974, the Metric Conversion Act was introduced in the House of Representatives. The Metric Conversion Act declared the metric system the, quote, preferred measurement system, but stressed that conversion was voluntary, as legislators believed that it would pass only if it was economical and not a great expense to the government. In addition, this legislation would create the U.S. Metric Board, which would be responsible for aiding companies in the process of conversion, but was not to be an advocacy group. In the House, the Metric Conversion Act was opposed, as metrication would require federal compensation for workers' expenses. The most aggressive opposition, though, came from labor unions. The core issue for labor was the belief that conversion would lead to widespread job loss. Most speculated that workers would be unable to learn the new system quickly enough, that metrication would make it easier for jobs to be placed offshore, and that they would not be fully reimbursed by the government for conversion costs. At this time, some industries began converting to the metric system, such as soft drink manufacturers and oil corporations. However, the majority of the labor force remained objected to metrication. Despite tenacious demur, in 1975 the Metric Conversion Act was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Though the purpose of the act was to aid labor unions, most industry workers believed that it would not and thus opposed it.
A lot of the backlash also was orchestrated by American labor, which saw it as part of a move to make it more easy to shift jobs offshore.
Though most labor unions shared similar notions, an organized opposition was never established as, in addition to these reasons, other industry-specific rationality prevented a collective statement. Though never unifying under a single body, each industry took a similar approach to opposition, as rather than aggressively protest, independent labor unions simply refused to use the system, and because conversion was officially voluntary, the government could not force it. As an increasing number of industries refused to use the metric system, the U.S. Metric Board and National Bureau of Standards became more aggressive in their advocacy, promulgating in a multitude of ways. Due to the increasing advocacy by the U.S. government and the refusal of labor unions to use the metric system, conflict augmented. Where one entity saw exponential economic growth, the other saw a great loss of American jobs, and neither side was willing to compromise on such salient issues. As tensions mounted, average citizens began voicing their views. Supporters of metrication contended that the metric system was more rational and that the opposition was too patriotic. However, those averse to metrication claimed that the customary system was more rational, that conversion posed a threat to national security, that conversion was unpatriotic, and that metrication simply was not necessary. Regardless, most Americans, though finding lively debate in the matter, were relatively unconcerned with the issue as it did little to influence their own life, and few were even aware of the passage of the Metric Conversion Act. In 1978, the U.S. Metric Board faced criticism for its part in advocating for the metric system, as it was designed to be objective regarding conversion. In response, rather than seek negotiation and compromise, the board claimed that it, quote, lacked the clear congressional mandate necessary to bring about national conversion. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan disestablished the U.S. Metric Board as it was no longer necessary due to the lack of interest in metrication and in an attempt to reduce federal spending. The Department of Commerce's metric program took up its mantle, its advocacy leading to the passage of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which amended the Metric Conversion Act. The 1988 legislation added several paragraphs which stated that America was at a growing disadvantage in foreign markets and suggested metrication. Although this legislation, like the Metric Conversion Act, was largely ignored by labor unions and the public alike, it was successful in complete governmental conversion. For the following years, conflict between metric advocates and critics was tenuous, until September 23, 1999, when NASA's Climate Orbiter crashed to the surface of Mars. It was quickly determined that the orbiter crashed because the engineers used English units, whereas the operators used metric units. This reignited mild conflict. Today, the United States is one of only 3 developed nations to use customary units. Vestiges of the conflict and absence of compromise between the U.S. government and labor can be seen in a myriad of industries. Some industries that did not contest conversion strongly have converted, such as food industries in which soft drinks and alcohol are sold by liters. Some argue that this is evidence which demonstrates that America, whether officially or not, is a metric country. Conversely, other industries that strongly oppose conversion have done very little to become metric, such as the jewelry industry, which continues to sell jewels by carats. Due to America's failure to adopt the metric system, many individuals of other nationalities regard Americans as stubborn, lackadaisical, ignorant, individualistic, and too patriotic. Over time, conflict lessens substantially, becoming more akin to debate. Rationalizations have maintained many original ideas, but have also expanded to include new technology and industries. In short, following centuries of debate in regards to metric conversion, the Metric Conversion Act was passed, becoming a catalyst for several years of conflict between the U.S. government and labor unions. The labor unions' opposition was characterized by whole industrial entities independently refusing to use the metric system. The government responded by fiercely advocating for metric conversion using intense propaganda campaigns. After several years of conflict, the U.S. government and labor unions alike abandoned metrication rather than seeking negotiation and compromise. Both parties' failure to compromise has made America one of 3 non-metric developed nations, which has had numerous effects on American industry and society. Because a resolution was never achieved, whether 1975 conversion was in America's best interest continues to be debated throughout the country. Overall, the conflict between labor unions and the American government in the 1970s regarding metrication and the failure to compromise has played a substantial role in making American industry what it is today, even if that means allowing it to remain fairly unchanged.
Good grief, who can keep track of the inch and foot, yard and rod, league and mile, teaspoon, tablespoon, pint and quart, bushel and a peck, not to mention avoir, du pois, and